Hello, I'm John David Bruja, standing in the Cape Elizabeth East Lantern Room. And welcome to a special edition of John's Traveling Movie Corner, United States Lighthouse Society, Southern Maine and New Hampshire tour. Welcome to episode 1 and our first day of traveling to lighthouses. Hello, I'm John David Bruja on location in Maine, standing in front of the Portland Head Lighthouse. Welcome to a special edition of John's Traveling Movie Corner, United States Lighthouse Society, Southern Maine and New Hampshire tour. Now on this tour, we hope to see anywhere between 25 and 30 lighthouses, museums, forts, movie locations, and so much more. I hope you enjoy the ride. Well, day 2, our trip begins with a slight hiccup. The 4-hour cruise that was planned this morning to see 5 lighthouses, including Nubble Island from the water, was canceled by the captain of the boat for safety reasons because of the rip currents and high surf. So instead, we will be taking a train ride, see a museum or two, see a couple of forts, and check out lighthouses in the distance, and who knows, maybe something else. And then we're back to our regularly scheduled tour this afternoon to stops at Cape Neddick and then tours of Cape Elizabeth West and East Light. Well, our first stop of the day is the Maine Narrow Gauge Railroad Company and Museum, and that's right, we'll be taking a 40-minute train ride and we'll be seeing some scenic views along the way, including the Portland Company building, which built some of these trains early on, Eastern Promenade Trail, Fort Gorges, Bug Light, also known as Portland Breakwater, East End Beach, Cutter Street, and the bridge. And the train comes to the stop at the end as we reach the western terminus of our route, where the former Grand Trunk Railroad swing bridge connected to the Portland Peninsula to the mainland sits. And it sits open because it's no longer in use. Well, we are continuing our makeshift schedule for the day, and we are now at Fort McClary, where we get the chance to see 2 lighthouses out in the distance. And as you can tell, the weather is really not cooperating that well. Fort McClary in Kittery Point, Maine, protected Maine as early as 1689, but permanent work was voted for in 1715. The Blockhouse in 1844, the Rifleman's House in 1808, Lower Battery around the early 1800s, and Granite Outer Wall during the Civil War era, which was left unfinished. As we continue our makeshift day, we are now at the Kittery Historical and Naval Museum with a chance to see a second-order Fresnel lens from Boone Island Lighthouse behind me. Along with the Fresnel lens, the Kittery Historical and Naval Museum, which opened to the public in 1977, contains a large collection of artifacts and exhibits pertaining to the history of Kittery and its naval heritage. In 2002, it expanded to accommodate the Andrews Mitchell Garrison House, a farmstead from the colonial era. Ironically, the city of Kittery is the furthest point in southern Maine, and it's also the oldest city in Maine. Well, we made another makeshift stop at Fort Foster to see the Whaleback Lighthouse and Wood Island Life-Saving Station in the background. Whaleback Lighthouse first arrived in 1830. The current 49-foot tall lighthouse arrived in 1872, and it was automated back in 1963. Wood Light Station first arrived in 1808, and the current 47-foot tall light station came in 1858. And across the way, the land that you see is New Hampshire. and the lighthouse is the Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse, also known as Newcastle Light, Fort Point Light, and Fort Constitution Light. It first arrived in 1771, the first lighthouse in the American colonies north of Boston. The current 48-foot tall light was built in 1877. Land was purchased on the southwest tip of Garish Island in 1872, and construction began the following year. It was one of the last old forts built in the Portsmouth area. We now continue our tour to Cape Neddick Lighthouse, and as you can see by the waves, why the captain canceled our cruise earlier today. Nubble Island Lighthouse was established in 1879 and built at a height of 41 feet with a fourth order lens. 500,000 people see the light from Sawyer Park every year. They wanted a lighthouse as early as 1800s, and finally in 1837, Congress appropriated $5,000, but it was refused and an unlighted beacon was suggested. In 1852, another $5,000, but again it was found unnecessary. Finally, after purchasing the island for $1,500, the cast iron 41-foot conical tower with the tower's interior lined with brick and 32 spiral steps to the watch room arrived. In 1888, a boathouse and boat slip was built, and a red oil house arrived in 1902. It was electrified in 1938. Nubble Lighthouse was automated in 1987, and the town adopted the station under the Maine Lights program in 1998. In 2017, a restoration project started with phases over the years, which concluded in 2021. We are now approaching Cape Elizabeth West Lighthouse. Cape Elizabeth West was established in 1828. The current was built in 1874 at a height of 67 feet. The west was deactivated in 1924, and the west-east tower was automated in 1963. The area was heavily traveled with over 98 vessels, wrecked on its shore from 1780 to 1990. Captain John Smith started the story of Cape Elizabeth Two Lights in 1614, honoring King Charles' sister, Prince Elizabeth. $7,500 in 1827 and 28 for a 65-foot tall tower light, not to be confused with Portland Head or Wood Island Two Lights, was decided the east tower light would be fixed and the west would have a revolving light. Built on 12 acres of land after purchase for $50, by 1843 the towers and dwellings were deteriorating. The west light was extinguished in 1855, but after several complaints, relit months later. It was dimmed again in 1883, but relit shortly afterwards until 1924, when it went dark for good. I am now ascending Cape Elizabeth West Light, and I made it up to the lantern room at Cape Elizabeth West Lighthouse. The West Tower became an observation point during World War II. Then the West Tower was auctioned off to the highest bidder in 1959. In 1971, actor Gary Merrill, ex-husband to Betty Davis, spent $28,000 for the West Light, but then sold it 12 years later. We are now approaching Cape Elizabeth East Lighthouse, and yes, we get to climb this one also. In 1873, $30,000 was given to rebuild the western tower, but instead two 67-foot matching towers 923 feet apart were built, and a second-order lens coming from the west light was placed in the east. At that time, the two lighthouses were painted brown, and in 1970, they were put on a postage stamp. Well, I climbed Cape Elizabeth West. Now I am climbing up Cape Elizabeth East. I made it up to Cape Elizabeth East Lighthouse Lantern Room. Even with the weather conditions outside today, the views from inside Cape Elizabeth East Lantern Room were incredible. I could see Cape Elizabeth West Lighthouse, and closer to the water, I could see the life-saving station and the fog station building, and of course, just to see the light in the lantern room itself. Well, our makeshift day has come to an end. Our first cruise was canceled, but despite the weather, we saw several lighthouses from a distance, got to see a couple up close and even climb them. We saw 2 forts, and we even was able to take a train ride. That's right, bonus attraction. We are at Acadia National Park, standing in front of Bass Harbor Head Lighthouse, which was first lit in 1858 at a height of 33 feet. The light was granted $5,000 for construction, and apparently $16 of it was returned. The house for the lightkeeper is still original, with only 10 feet added on in the 1900s. The fog bell was removed. The oil house was added in 1902. A barn in 1905, and it's still there. The brick light was automated in 1974 with a 4th order lens, which was replaced by a 5th. Well, it's another bonus attraction, and it's a lighthouse, but it's a lighthouse that we did not see on our tour. Fort Point Lighthouse. Fort Point Lighthouse is in Stockton Springs, Maine, located at, of course, Fort Point Park. In 1834, $5,000 was allocated to build a conical tower here at Fort Point, at the entrance of Penobscot Bay. Along with a dwelling and an octagonal iron tower with 8 lamps with 13-inch reflectors, Fort Point was lit in 1836. In 1855, the tower was deemed worn out, and a new one was built in 1857 at a height of 31 feet. The square brick tower was then stored with a 4th order lens, and a 2-story dwelling was also completed. Over the years, other items arrived, like a new lantern in 1868, a bell tower and barn in 1890, and an oil house in 1897. It was electrified in 1950 and automated in 1988. And Fort Point Lighthouse is still active today and is only one of 9 lighthouses in Maine still using a historic Fresnel lens. And the station's bell tower is one of the few remaining in New England and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. I'm John David Bruja, on location in Maine, standing in front of the Portland Head Lighthouse. This has been a special edition of John's Traveling Movie Corner, United States Lighthouse Society, Southern Maine and New Hampshire tour. I hope you enjoyed the ride. And I would like to thank the owner of the West Cape Elizabeth Lighthouse, Ken Lane, for allowing us inside and access all the way to the tower. And I would like to thank the American Lighthouse Foundation for allowing us inside and all the way up the tower of Cape Elizabeth East Light. And I would like to thank the volunteers and staff at the Kittery Historical and Naval Museum for allowing us access inside their building to see all the wonderful artifacts in the 2nd order lens. you.